Our next speaker is Will Landau from Eli Lilly. And welcome, Will.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes.
Good. Are my slides visible?
Yes, they are.
All right, thank you. In the life sciences, we develop ambitious computation for statistics and data science. There's a lot of Bayesian analysis, machine learning, etc. And these projects require long run times. So MCMC and deep neural nets are expensive. It could take several minutes or even hours just to fit a single model. So when the code is under rapid development, we often run into trouble. So a large workflow has a bunch of moving parts. If you change one of these stages, then everything that depends on it is no longer valid, and you need to rerun the computation to bring the results back up to date. So changes like this happen all the time, and they usually happen much faster than it actually takes to run the project, and there's no way the results can keep up with that, unless you use a make-like pipeline tool to avoid repeating yourself. And there are some great pipeline tools for workflow automation, but historically not a whole lot for R. And this is where the new targets package comes in. Targets is a make-like pipeline tool fundamentally designed for R. But what about Drake? There's a package called Drake, and it already does this. And in fact, it's never going away, and I plan to maintain it indefinitely. However, Drake has improved so much over the last 4 years that the only non-trivial way left to make progress for users to a meaningful extent is to finally confront the systematic limitations that Drake is stuck with forever. Limitations so deep in the architecture that we can't fix them without breaking the tool or existing projects that use it. So to move the general capability forward beyond what Drake will ever be capable of, we need a new package, and that package is called Targets. So first of all, Targets is deliberately less flexible. Less flexibility is actually a good thing here. It means more guardrails. So Targets runs the pipeline in a clean, fresh, reproducible R process by default, and it has strict policies about your working directory and data store. So it's an all-around more reproducible, more dependable, and smoother experience for the user. Now for data management, Drake's cache actually has a large number of cryptically named files, and which means it's not very portable, and it's pretty brittle actually. Targets, on the other hand, simplifies storage. The data store is light, portable, resilient, and easy to understand. It can recover if a data file breaks, and third-party products like Git and Dropbox and OneDrive have a much easier time. The simpler data store also paved the way for seamless Metaflow-like integration with Amazon S3 on the cloud. After just a little bit of config, Targets can automatically upload output to an S3 bucket and track it there. And retrieving cloud data feels exactly the same as retrieving local data. Drake tells you which targets are out of date, but it says less about functions. The Targets package is more introspective. It shows the status of functions as well, and it makes it easier to find out why certain aspects of the work are not up to date. Dynamic branching is also more flexible. Targets lets you take a data frame, group it with dplyr, and then dynamically branch over the subsets. So folks have been asking for this in Drake for years, and it's only possible now because unlike Drake, Targets is dynamic to the core. Dynamic branching is also more efficient. So because of the original design of the architecture in Drake, we were forced to use a map reduce mindset when it came to branching. But in Targets, downstream branches can start even if some of the upstream branches are still running. So your work gets done faster. And finally, Targets is easier to build on and extend. There is a way to declare a target while avoiding non-standard evaluation entirely, which opens a Pandora's box of third-party interface development. The package called archetypes, which is a companion to Targets, takes advantage of this. It's full of little archetypes for commonly used targets. tar render, for example, seamlessly integrates dependency-aware R Markdown into pipelines as components of pipelines, including, but not limited to, parameterized R Markdown reports where the parameters are actually upstream targets. So let's go to an example. I'm part of a capabilities team at Lilly, and we spend a lot of time designing and simulating clinical trials. And of course, this year, we're busy with COVID-19. We've been using Drake to manage the computation almost the entire time, and here's how it works in targets. This particular example is oversimplified and pedagogical and not tied to any one particular real-life trial, but it does get across the way we think about the computation in general. We start by setting up an organized file structure. This part is up to us as users. It's outside the scope of the tool. So we borrow from existing established conventions around R packages and research compendia. Just like Drake, for most of our code, we're going to write our own functions, our own custom functions, and each function should have no side effects. And the return value should be a nice, clean R object that humans can understand and a computer can serialize. User-defined functions for data analysis usually have one of three purposes: to get data, analyze data, or summarize things. So you're usually going to return a data set, a fitted model, or a table or figure. The _targets.r file is special. That's where we define the pipeline. It has a bunch of targets, and each target is a skippable step of the computation. Again, usually a data set, analysis, or summary. It has a name and it has a command to return a value. A target should be small enough to take a byte out of the runtime, but it should be large enough to take a byte out of the runtime, but small enough so that some targets can be skipped even if others need to run. Now, before you actually run the pipeline, always look at the graph. Targets automatically figures out the dependency relationships and execution order using static code analysis, and this all happens automatically, so you want to make sure that things are properly connected before you deploy a long set of jobs. We actually run the pipeline with one of the tar make functions. This one talks to computing clusters. It runs the correct targets in the correct order, farms out to a bunch of remote nodes, and writes the return values to storage. All this is automatic, so your custom functions can focus on the actual methodology instead of micromanaging the details of parallel processing. After that, targets, all the targets return values are in a special data store, and there are helper functions to retrieve the data based on the variable name. Now let's add new targets to the pipeline, in this case, new simulation scenarios. The new targets are out of date, and the downstream targets are called into question. So when we run the pipeline again, only the new simulation scenarios actually get computed. Anything already up to date gets skipped. In our case, that's 2,000 expensive Bayesian models we don't need to run. And our final results reflect the new targets we added. At the end of the day, the targets package can tell you if everything is up to date. This is tangible evidence that your output matches the code and data it's supposed to come from. It's evidence that someone else running the same code would get the same results. And you don't have to run a time-consuming analysis to rerun the project to prove it. So workflow automation with a tool like Targets is just as important to reproducibility as literate programming with R Markdown or version control with Git or the ways you organize files in a project. Targets is currently under review at rOpenSci, and it should go to CRAN in a couple months. In the meantime, you can get it from GitHub. There are a bunch of resources, including the half-day workshop I gave at this conference last week. Finally, I'd like to thank Pharma for the opportunity, and I'd like to thank everyone who adopted this package early. The feedback was incredibly useful.
Thank you, Will. That was an amazing talk.